Don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about ideas and issues important to education. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these dialectic conversations for intellectually rigorous educators. In this episode, I'm joined by Haili Hughes, who recently joined Trobe University in Melbourne as an associate professor. Haili is a prolific and interesting thinker on education matters, and I was pleased she agreed to join me. Some of the main pieces this conversation focused on include issues of education tribalism, integrating research and practice, including cognitive science and inquiry-related approaches, and teacher development and empowerment. A reminder that you can find our professional learning work, blog posts, and podcast episodes at wegrowteachers.com. We're also in the early bird registration phase for our Inquiry Grow 26 event, which will be October 26th and 27th, and focused on our knowledge-rich inquiry approach. That's also at wegrowteachers.com, where you'll see the link along the top of the site, or you can go to wegrowteachers.com/Inquiry Grow 26. We're also working on an immersive leadership cohort for the fall and the 26-27 school year, so keep an eye and ear out for details on that to be shared soon. As always, please reach out to me at drew@thoughtstretchers.org if you have questions or comments. Now, here's our conversation. I am with, and I'm going to try to pronounce her name correctly, Haili Hughes, and she's joining me from Melbourne. Recently there, she's got no books behind her because her things are, as she said before we started recording, in a box somewhere in Singapore waiting to be delivered. She is now the associate professor at La Trobe, if I think I've got that correct. Yeah. But I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and give a little background so folks know who they are watching and or listening to.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Drew. Really excited. So my name's Haili Hughes. I am an associate professor, as Drew said, at Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. I've been in Melbourne for a grand total of 3.5 weeks. So I've just got over my jet lag, essentially, from coming from the UK. So prior to that, I was a school leader and a teacher in secondary schools and a professor at Academic University of Applied Sciences in the Netherlands, where I still work as well alongside my role at La Trobe, but I'm a visiting professor there now. So my background is very much in English teaching, leading professional development at scale, teacher retention, instructional coaching and mentoring as well. I'm all about the teacher. So, making sure that our teachers are happy, professionally fulfilled, and are at their best so that the students that are in front of them get the best deal.
Okay. And tell us a little bit about your schooling when you were a kid. What was that like? Well, how would you describe it, characterize it? Traditional, progressive, somewhere in the middle, a little bit of both, all of the above, none of the above?
Probably quite progressive, actually. So I went to school in the 1980s and 1990s. So I was in primary school in the 1980s, and then in secondary school in the 1990s, and then went to university in the early 2000s. So, I don't ever remember being taught any grammar, for example, in English, like at all. It was a lot of kind of story writing, creative stuff, poetry. I remember doing a lot of kind of quite kinesthetic hands-on tasks, a lot of inquiry learning. And then, of course, what that meant is that when I became a teacher myself, I thought that was the way to teach. And I wasn't really taught any different, in all honesty, when I did my teacher training.
Okay. And so you grew up in the UK, is that right? Is it all of that schooling in the UK?
Yeah. So I grew up in the northwest in the UK, in a town called Warrington, which is quite close to Manchester. So you can probably hear in my accent, very Mancunian. So it's sort of between Manchester and Liverpool. Warrington at the time in the 1980s. I mean, before this, it's quite funny because we had a chat about possibly getting political, possibly not. But when I talk about my upbringing in the 1980s, for anyone who knows what was going on politically in the UK, it's impossible not to get political. So we had a prime minister, very famous one, Margaret Thatcher, teacher who I would say, I think it's fair to say, decimated the north where I lived in terms of industry. So I grew up in a town that was struggling, that was on its knees, where a lot of young men were depressed because they couldn't get work because a lot of industry was closing down. So I grew up, I would say, in a socio-economically deprived background, I think it's fair to say, and didn't really have any sort of role models in terms of people who had gone on to do further study or to get what I would term a professional career at that point. So my role models came from books that I read or, TV programs, because from a very, very young age, I was desperate to go to university. I love to read and learn. Growing up in those surroundings, I think, makes you a fierce advocate for equity. And that's how I've spent the whole of my career fighting for that equity for pupils, which then leads to the work I've done on teacher development.
Okay, so I'm looking at your Substack and the description, which is amusing. And it says, the Taylor Swift of education. I experienced it, I blog about it. And I think I had seen somewhere where you, at least at some point, had recently a lengthy subway ride. And so you were blogging much more heavily than normal, but that was about to maybe come to a bit of an end, or at least limited a little bit. And I think I had seen somewhere in one of your descriptions that you would style yourself as a science of learning advocate. Would that be fair?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. My job in England involved me traveling 3 hours there and 3 hours back. So I was spending sort of Monday and Tuesday mornings prolifically substacking on the train, and then stacking them up for the rest of the week and scheduling them. So those people who follow me will notice that I'm probably writing twice a week if I can now, and they're much shorter. So I do love to write, but obviously needs must, especially with starting a new job. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm an advocate of the science of learning. I'm an advocate of knowledge-rich curricula. I'm an advocate of teachers being equipped with the professional knowledge to be able to have agency to make those better professional decisions. And that seems to be a bizarre place to be, because education is so binary and people are either kind of black or white. And actually I'm coming to people saying, look, my position's absolutely clear. I think we need the science of learning and knowledge-rich curricula, etc., for teachers to actually, and explicit instruction, I will add to that, for teachers actually to be able to have better agency and make those professional decisions. Because as my colleague and friend Carl Hendrick says, you cannot join the dots if you cannot see them. And that's the point, isn't it? So yeah, I come from a place that I would say is not easily definable, really.
Yeah, so one of the things that I tend to have lots of conversation about, both online, sort of asynchronously on social media, and then sometimes here on the podcast, is sort of exploring the nooks and crannies of, science of learning, cognitive science. I would say I'm an inquiry advocate, but I also think it's really important. The work that we do, I do professional development, a lot of project-based learning, a lot of inquiry, what I call knowledge-rich inquiry. And I think it's really, really important to include, and I think the inquiry end of the spectrum has really sort of fallen short on the way that they talk about and maybe even functionally exclude, the knowledge pieces of that. The idea that kids can just Google it; they don't need to know things and things like that. Which I think we. And I really work hard to disabuse teachers that we work with on that. We call it knowledge-rich inquiry.
Yeah.
And really trying to sort of take on some of the science of learning kinds of concepts, cognitive science, because I do think it's really important. But as you mentioned, everything seems to be, or so much seems to be, really, really binary, right? And so I'm curious how you sort of feel or see or perceive, how would you characterize sort of the state of maybe education, the conversations that you're having and seeing, and especially coming from that science of learning perspective?
In Australia or more widely?
Just more widely.
Yeah. So I think what's really interesting is that everywhere that I work, so every kind of place that I go to, different continents, different countries, all to me seem to have a sort of different ideological understanding of what terms like explicit instruction, direct instruction, knowledge rich, etc. mean. I think sort of speaking from a kind of UK-centric point of view, which, let's face it, is where I've spent the first 43 years of my life, I think there's more nuance now in the UK about this stuff than there ever was. But I think that's because over the last 10 years, it's been a kind of really quite embarrassing battle at times between different ideological camps, whereby, you know, we had sort of people saying, oh, all inquiry's absolute nonsense, and then people saying, oh, well, the science of learning is like a concentration camp and it's cruel, and, you know, and all this kind of mad stuff that came out on the internet. And I think what really frustrates me as somebody who literally left school 3 weeks ago, you know, I'm not some kind of lofty professor sat in an ivory tower. You know, 3 weeks ago I was doing break duty in a high vis. You know, it's what really frustrates me is that teachers don't care about this stuff. Like, teachers don't know who all of these like big players on Twitter /X who are having these petty little arguments between one another. Teachers just want to like be equipped with tools to get on with the job. So I think the conversations I have in England are around that bent now. I think that people are kind of going, actually, maybe we went too far in all of that stuff, and actually maybe there is a place for both of them together. Maybe they don't have to be at odds. I think in Australia, it's a really, probably quite similar to my experiences in the US, to be honest. It's a huge place. Every single state is like its own country. So things that go on in New South Wales might be slightly different from Victoria and Western Australia, etc. And I think the kind of understanding about what the science of learning is here, I think is still in its infancy. And because it's in its infancy, I think there are those petty squabbles going on here that we saw in England sort of 10 years ago, whereby we're saying that, you know, to codify teaching techniques, to, you know, have a shared mental model in a school of what effective teaching looks like is anti-agency, is deprofessionalizing teachers. And actually my point is that I don't think it is. I think those things are tools. It's how you treat and implement those tools as leaders. So if you implement it from a top-down point of view, where it's like, I want to come into your lesson and see you following these 3 parts, and if you're not doing I do, we do, you do at these times, well, you're in my office. That's anti-agency. But actually we don't see that as much in England now. We went through a period of that, but actually a lot of like the big multi-academy trusts, for example, are decentralizing in England now. So they've realized that schools are contextual, and that actually being top down like that and saying, I do first 10 minutes, we do second 10 minutes, you do for the rest of the lesson, is actually anti the research it was first based on. So a lot of my conversations now are turning towards more of the lethal mutations of the science of learning, which is, I'm writing a book about that with Kate Jones and David Goodwin at the moment. But I think that's, a lot of people are now starting to question things a bit more, but they're only able to question things because they understand how students learn. Because if they didn't, they wouldn't be able to question it, because they wouldn't know what they didn't know. So I think it's inherently been a good thing, that whole movement, but actually we're now starting to think about it in much more complex ways.
Yeah, well, so that sort of tribalism, that us versus them binary stuff, and I don't expect you to have a good answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. When we think about how to bridge those gaps, whether it's coming from, you know, the inquiry into the spectrum, or from the, you know, traditional explicit instruction, whatever you want to call that, end of the spectrum, you know, what I advocate for is generally sort of yes and instead of either or yes, you know, some sort of algorithmic kind of approach, and I think cognitive science and science of learning is best viewed as sort of a heuristic, right? But it really, and maybe it's more of a function of, you know, social media, but because that's the bulk of the back and forth that I seem to have. But what strikes me, and I've heard this from other people as well, is that the sort of critiques and questions that are, at least mine, are in good faith. I mean, sometimes I surely get a little snippy, or, you know, sometimes it can be easy to do, right? And I'm certainly
an angel in that respect, but I generally directionally try to be, in good faith, because I'm trying to push people's thinking, right? I'm trying to okay, so in what ways might this be true, and how might this not be true? And when I get a sense of certainty, I have that instinct to want to push, whether it's from one end or the other.
Yeah.
So what that is often met with, and it's not just me, but my experience is certainly that's feels like obfuscation or some sort of challenge, like the other gets into this defensive position, and it becomes a debate, and not what I'm generally looking for is dialectic, right? Like I want to figure out what's true, not true. But I guess so. All of that long-winded way to ask, what have you, if anything, found in terms of helping people who might be paying attention to some of this and might be sort of embroiled in some of the back and forth, to sort of bridge that gap and to say, wait a minute here, let me think about this for a second?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot. You talked about tribalism, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think that word is the perfect way to describe it. But I think when I speak to people who are kind of confused about which way to go because of all of this, because of listening to some of these big voices, who are very loud on social media, sort of rowing with one another, I think the way to kind of help teachers with that and leaders is to say, actually, this all goes back to learning problems. What learning problems are you experiencing in your classroom? Because actually you might think, well, I'm a bit progressive and this traditional person here has got nothing in common with me. But if you start talking, you've got the same learning problems. It's just that you're trying to solve those learning problems in maybe a slightly different way from them. So it all comes back to that for me. It's the commonality of actually, what is this in service of? What are the learning problems? What information, knowledge, tools, expertise do we have at our fingertips to be able to solve these learning problems? And you'll often find that people on either side of those debates, that's where they meet, because it's the same problems. No matter where you go in the world, educators are facing the same problems.
Yeah, and I've had that experience in some cases, and usually it's conversations on the podcast. But I've also had some folks, and maybe you have or haven't had this experience, where they're one of the sort of features of the quote unquote and science of learning is a broad term, right? And I think it's important, and I want it to succeed. But sometimes, I think there's some, as you say, some sort of lethal mutations. What strikes me is just like there's such a priority on knowledge building. Like, okay, so we've got the instructional hierarchy, and we've got to have the expertise reversal effect in mind, and novices can't think like experts, and like they've got all the lingo, and it's almost these reflexive responses when you say, well, what would it be possible to do? In what ways might it be possible to do inquiry first? And it's like the knee-jerk reaction I get is something like the expertise reversal effect says novices can't be. I mean, it's almost like a little script, and it feels to me on some of those folks. I'm curious if you've experienced this, and maybe you've experienced the exact opposite from the other end of the spectrum, that they are so focused on building the knowledge and that schema background and whatever you want to call it, surface learning, that I so very rarely hear them talk about getting into anything that's deep learning, that I just wonder if they're actually getting there. So I guess I'm kind of in some ways finding that there isn't necessarily, I suppose there's some commonality, right? Because I want to build that knowledge too, but I want to build that knowledge in service of deeper learning.
Yeah.
Whereas it seems like the number one priority is efficiency and building the knowledge, and we're just so focused on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that probably is what they're focused on, but on social media it probably comes across like that, because I think platforms like X and LinkedIn to a certain extent now, I think they're just poor proxies for places to have reasonable debate and conversations about education. I've seen some another classic example is kind of all the rhetoric that's going on about alpha schools at the moment, and I don't have a massive opinion on alpha. I haven't visited, I don't know that much about it. I find the whole thing fascinating and interesting. But some of like the mudslinging and the name calling I've seen going on for people who are like, doing work for them at the moment. And, that's on Twitter as well. So I just think Twitter is like a really poor place. It's full of straw men arguments. And yeah, I like to get in a room with somebody. I've heard, for example, people saying things about, people whose work I really admire and know things about and know them personally. I've seen them saying, oh, they're trying to make teachers do X, Y, and Z. But then if those people who were saying that were actually in a room with that person and saw them speaking, I mean, Doug Lamov is a classic example. The stuff I've seen written about Teach Like Champion on social media is just horrific. And then whenever I've seen Doug speak, he actually says, this is just a tool. You can use it or you don't have to. It's up to you. But these people, who are so anti-TLAC would say he's forcing teachers. He's saying that's the only way. And he's so far away from that. So, yeah, I mean, Doug's just one example, but, that social media is full of it. So I just think it's a poor place to try and debate anything in good faith.
Yeah, there's no argument there. I mean, it's such a strange back and forth. I mean, I've had some really interesting and useful, I think, conversations, but it does tend to, if there's any sort of friction, it's nearly impossible to get somewhere productive. When there's not friction, then it's probably a little bit more, and I think Doug Lamov is a good example. I really don't know that much about Doug's work. I've seen some of the nasty comments and worse. I can't remember. Somebody recently just made some claim about his work, and it was really. I said, I'm not a super big fan of his work, and he and I have had a little bit of back and forth that hasn't been very productive, and probably be characterized much worse than that. But that doesn't mean we should be saying, things that I can't even remember what it was that they said, and people calling, like, I think was it Greg Ashman or Adam Boxer or somebody like called their work and, like made threats or some, it's crazy stuff. Like, come on, people.
This is it. I mean, at the end of the day, we're all teachers, right? Or ex-teachers, just trying to do the best for kids that are in our care. That's all we're doing. And to have threats against you because of some of your work, I just think is beyond the pale. Look, the way I survive it is that I will try and have like a decent dialogue with somebody. If that dialogue turns nasty, or if like there's no kind of curiosity about wanting to hear another person's perspective, I just block them, because you know what, life's too short. And I think some people are just out for an argument, and maybe that makes me live in an echo chamber. But actually, the people I really respect are the ones who are endlessly curious, because I know that I've been a teacher and a leader for over 20 years, and the more I learn, the more experience I get, the less actually absolutely dead certain I am about stuff, because I learn things and I think, I never thought of it in that perspective. And they're the people I respect. So people like Christian Bokove, Oliver Cavigliole, all of these people who are not ideological. They might tweet about, cognitive load one day, but then the next day they might tweet about something that's completely unrelated to that and has made them think twice. Look, they're the people I respect, the ones who are endlessly curious, who haven't bought a t-shirt saying completed it, mate, again, about teaching, because you never do.
So let's talk about some of the blog pieces that caught my interest. And one of the things that's going around on said internet and Twitter and what have you is about the sort of crisis of research, and education research being one of those things. I saw something today I don't know if it was true, it's on the internet, so it must be true, but it was something about sociology research replicable, like 25% of the time, education research 0%, which I can't believe to be zero, but just sort of begs the question about the issue of education research. And, I was talking with Dylan William on a panel talking about Paul Black and his work, who's of course recently passed. And one of the things he said was, the education research is not as nearly as reliable as the certainty that people who often cite it there's like this idea that, oh, there's this study that means this is always true and will always be true, like that kind of thing. So I know you have a blog piece, 10 Lethal Mutations of Educational Research. So where are you on educational research at this point?
I mean, I talk about this a lot, and it's always so funny when I talk about it with schools, and you can kind of see the teachers and leaders kind of squirming at some of the stuff I'm saying, thinking, yeah, we do that. And I don't blame them, because, school leaders are under such pressure to be evidence informed, research informed, whatever that means, and to implement things yesterday, and get it done quickly to create impact, that lethal mutations are bound to happen. So look, when I first started teaching, on my PGCE, sort of the system in England is you do an undergraduate degree and then do a postgraduate certificate to become a teacher. So you're a specialist. So I did an English degree first and then was a journalist for a period of time. And when I trained to teach, I do remember sort of reading some bits of research, probably things like Piaget, Vygotsky, etc. I remember reading them and thinking, yeah, this is really interesting, but then going into my classroom on my placement to teach English and forgetting everything that I'd ever read, because it didn't really seem to me like it was making any kind of impact or bridging anything that I was doing in my classroom. And I probably taught for, I reckon, 10 years without really ever consciously reading a piece of research again after my PGCE. And I was working with a mentor. You have a mentor for the first year, or you did when I was training in England. And that mentor teacher, they could be good, they could be absolutely rubbish, and mine was rubbish and was not really a great teacher either. So I used to watch her teach and think, Christ, the behaviour management's shocking in this, I could do better myself. And I remember she could never really explain to me or tell me how to get better in the granular kind of way that I needed at that point. So, she would often say, oh, you're struggling with behaviour, go and watch the deputy head because he's really good with behaviour. So I'd go in and watch the deputy head. I'd make pages full of really surface level notes of what he had done and what he'd said, then try to have a conversation with him at the end of the lesson. And he was like, I just did it. So there was no kind of conscious sort of dealing with education research, or even thinking about the processes of how we do things, that expertise learning. So I got better, I would say, through sheer luck, vibes and osmosis, literally, because there was no other way to do it. So in 2015, I went to a research ed conference organised by Tom Bennett. And my eyes were just opened to this world of teachers who read research, because research to me was chucked down from towers by professors, and teachers were trying to catch it. I often use that cartoon in keynotes that I deliver of teachers saying, what should we do with it? And the professors going well, that's not our problem. We write it. You do something with it. So I wouldn't want to go back to the old days, actually, of teachers not engaging with research at all, because I don't think that's good. Because if we're not engaging with research, as Sir Kevin Collins, who used to be the boss at the Education Endowment Foundation, said, if we're not using research, what are we using? Bias, So I think research is important, but I also think teachers need much more time to engage thoughtfully with research. They need training on what research means, its limitations, etc. Methodologies. So I think there's a lot of people making a living from kind of disseminating research to teachers, and I've done that as well, through books, blogs, etc. But teachers actually need the time to weigh up that research. So research informed for me means the research plus the professional expertise, where the decision making comes in, and that means research informed. I think it's Dylan William who says, teaching can never be a research-based profession, because most of, even the cog sci research, most of it's in labs with maths undergraduates. How do we then contextualize that for our kindergarten kids or our students who are sat debating, Homer in English? So, yeah, I think educational research is a good thing if it's useful to teachers, but so many millions of pounds are wasted a year on what becomes pet projects for professors, etc., and make absolutely no impact on the teachers who are in the classrooms. But actually, some research isn't actually undertaken to do that anyway. So a lot of professors aren't professing that, you know, research that they're doing is going to change, you know, Mrs. Black's work in, you know, year 4 on a Thursday afternoon. It's bigger than that. But I think there does need to be kind of a special branch, I think, of teacher research that helps teachers get to grips with all of this, because when we get these lethal mutations, it's often because the teachers haven't read the original research. They've looked at a one-pager that came from a blog, which came from an EduBook, which came from a Twitter tweet. So it's so far removed that that's when we get the lethal mutations. I had a conversation with a group of leaders the other day about retrieval practice, and they've mandated it as do nows in the first 5 minutes of every single lesson. So I said to them, how come you've mandated it in the first five minutes? And they were like, oh, because of the research. And I said, oh, right, what research? Tell me the research, because they don't know, because another school started doing do nows. And I said, well, actually, if you read Rodiger and Carpike or any of the original research on retrieval practice, nowhere in any of that research does it mandate it at the beginning of the lesson. What they're using it for is actually a settler for behaviour. That's fine. Just be honest about it. It's not retrieval. So, you know, yeah, I've got big thoughts about research. I could rant about it all day.
Yeah, well, so let's stay on that thread, and maybe bring in an example that you know certainly gets talked about a lot. And I talked with John Sweller, so cognitive load theory, right? And you know, one of the things that you've recognized, and I think many of us recognize, is that research is important, but as Dylan Williams said, like, there's just no way that teachers have the time to read all this research. And so it does come down to one-pagers and books.
Which are great, by the way. Which are great.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But, you know, how do we, like with something like cognitive load theory, which of course there's a couple seminal papers, but then there's other things that have been written. There's continuing work. I've been trying to get Kalyuga on, because he's doing, I think, some really interesting work about complex learning and thinking about cognitive load. And so when you work with teachers, I assume cognitive load theory is a part of the conversation. How do you help? What do you do, and how do you work with them to help them understand functionally and practically and pragmatically something like cognitive load theory? Do you have them read the paper? Do you one pager for them? Something like that?
Yeah. So, I mean, if we're sort of thinking about, like, let's think about like Kirshner, Sweller and Clark's work, for example. So I would usually show them the fantastic Oliver Caviglioli head thing about how learning happens. I think it's originally taken from Dan Willingham's work, isn't it? I think. So I would show them the head, and I would get them to explain to one another what they think this shows about how learning happens. Then you get the chance to hear lots of misconceptions and things and unpick it. So then I tell them what this diagram, which comes from the research, tells us about how learning happens. I would have asked them already to have read at least a section of the paper before we came with the main takeaways. Then we discuss the implications of the paper. But actually, what I think's missing from this whole research conversation is, again, taking it back to learning problems. Because you go in any classroom in England, and every teacher you speak to will be able to cite cognitive load, will be able to tell you about working memory, long-term memory, the fact that working memory is a bottleneck, the fact that when we encode information and knowledge into our long-term memory, it's encoded in schemas. They can say all of the lingo. It's like a bingo card. But what they can't then do is take that understanding of how students learn without explicit help doing it to be relevant for their learning problems. So after they've done that, you've got a big page of learning problems that teachers would have or experience. Get them to pick one of the learning problems and then look back at the learning model and talk about how that learning model explains that learning problem. And that's the key. It's what they need is that concrete representation of actually the amount of times I've seen the penny drop there and go, oh, well, that might be because there's too much extraneous load. So what we need to do is optimize their cognitive load by X, Y, and Z. so very often it's like that CPD effect, isn't it, of going in and making reams and reams of notes of a speaker and then putting them in your drawer and never going back to him. So teachers need to know how that research is going to help them solve their learning problems. How is it relevant to them? So that's what I would do. I'm not going to expect any teacher to go away and read 5 seminal papers on cognitive load, because they've not got time. They're not that interested, in all honesty. They're up to here with everything they've got to do. So it's people like mine job to help teachers with that stuff. And it's not about simplifying the research. It's about helping them make the links between what research is telling us and how that might help them solve their learning problems in practice. It becomes relevant then, doesn't it?
Right, and which I think gets at the sort of idea of making meaning, which I think is really, really important. And again, something that I wish more of the science of learning sort of advocates, and sometimes I call them activists. I don't mean that pejoratively, but there is a sort of mode of like I'm spreading the gospel of the science of learning, and the question, like, because what they tend to sort of do is like, okay, let's find agreement, make sure the students are answering the questions right, mini-whiteboards or whatever it might be. But that's not the same as making meaning, right? No. How do we really get what's in students' heads out and what they're thinking? Not do they know the answer? Talk about a poor proxy. That's certainly one of them, right? Yeah. And so, when I think about cognitive load, and okay, so let's say we've got an example where we've recognized that perhaps a student has too much load. There's extraneous, all the things, right? What are the things that, as you said, how can we remedy that situation? How can we solve for that learning problem? Is the go-to move is, I think, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, is to sort of atomize things and make them more simple, right? I think, and I think this is why I wanted to talk with Kalyuga, I think there's also a way that inquiry can be a part of that, very carefully, right? And I was trying to get at this when I was talking with Sweller, we didn't quite get to it, but like, is there something that, because if you're talking about the sort of cognitive load, one way to sort of think about it is like, all right, there's like too much friction here, right? Like I'm carrying too heavy a load, but a burst of adrenaline gets you to like pull that in a way that you couldn't before, or you're in an emergency and you can just flip over a car. I'm just remembering things from when I was a kid in the 80s, and these amazing stories, right? So are there things besides the atomization and chunking it and making it more simple that can sort of ease that cognitive load, or is really that the best way in your mind?
Well, I'm an English teacher, so for me, it's dialogue and giving students the opportunity to talk to one another, and I mean beyond turn and talk as well. Turn and talk, great. Think, pair, share, great strategies for teachers to use. I think particularly to check for understanding. But as an English teacher, I've seen like a worrying trend in the last 10 years, and I know that Barbara Blyman and colleagues at the English Association talk about this in England all the time. But this worrying trend of kind of silent classrooms where students don't really spend any long time kind of talking about their opinions. And for English, for texts, that is just so important, because, I want students, when they study a text, to join a long line of critiques, essentially, about that text. And if they don't get the chance to add their voice to the debate about how that text has been seen and understood, then what is even the point of English? So for me, I think that atomization is really important, as you said, to optimize that cognitive load. But we also need to give students a chance to kind of have that deep learning, those deep conversations. And I was thinking about writing a blog about this the other day, and how, like, checking for understanding is one of, I think, the most high leverage things a teacher can do in a classroom to help students make progress. But it's what comes after that. If a whole class is just a constant stream of mini whiteboards, turn and talk, where is that chance, that opportunity for pushing and depth? So it needs to be measured for me.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Mark Enser?
Yeah, I know Mark really well. Yeah, friends with him and his wife, Zoe.
Oh, well, I just talked with him this morning.
That's great.
For the episode that if you're listening to this episode, you can go back and listen to the previous one. But he'd written a blog piece. I've got it right here: a pedagogy for power for knowledge: why dialogue, inquiry, and cognitive science aren't competing answers. I don't know if you've seen it, but
not seen it, but he's spot on.
Yeah. I mean, the ways in which dialogue and inquiry and knowledge and cognitive science sort of synergistically should be synergistically sort of leveraged to get to that sort of deep learning. And again, you identified something that I'm concerned about, not because I think science of learning is wrong, but because I think science of learning is right, and I want science of learning, cognitive science, to be successsul. And what we don't want is for it to just fade away because it's sort of had these lethal mutations or the tribalism, that kind of thing. But like I saw a teacher on Twitter who it's come across Doug Lamov's work and crafted this I guess outline of a lesson plan using his format. Great, no worries. But I said, so how are you checking for understanding and checking, are the students making meaning? How are you getting them to that deeper learning? And she said, well, I haven't got there yet. And we'll give her grace. Hopefully she's going to get there, and that's the next step. But my fear is that that's all we do, right? Like that's kind of what you're talking about. It's like, so we're just doing this thing, or on the other end of the spectrum, we're just doing inquiry, and there's not the building of knowledge, there's not explicit instruction, there's not the things that need to happen there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to go away and read Mark's blog after this. I just love everything that he writes. But I think that's spot on. A happy medium and probably the effective practice is somewhere in the middle, isn't it? And very often, people I speak to, young sort of novice teachers, if you like, will say to me, I don't do any kind of paired work in my class or group work or discussion work. And that's often a fear of that taking hold and letting go with behaviour a lot of the time. But if we have kind of new teachers who are doing no paired work, no group work, no dialogic work, no space for students to articulate things and, discuss things and change the mind and debate things, well, what we're going to get in sort of 10 years' time is whole group of leaders who don't think that stuff's important. And I think this was recognised in England a year or so ago a couple of years ago when the Labour Party first came into power, because the Education Secretary at the time, Bridget Phillipson, she ordered an oracy review, and there was a commission that was headed up by Jeff Barton and a big report written. And Tom Sherrington has walkthroughs have done a partnership with Voice 21, a big oracy charity in the UK. So these things are making their way back into school, and there's always been advocates along that way for why did we get rid of this stuff. But I think in education we're so guilty of being like either or, as you said at the beginning, and it's like, people get so kind of like vehement and tribalistic about these things that actually the pendulum swings too far the other way. And I certainly don't want to go into classes where students are terrified to even give an opinion. Like in my subject in English, that's the death of the subject. It's the death of it. So I just think you're going to have extremists on either end, but the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I always think that Mark sits really well in that middle ground, and I'd like to think I join him.
Yeah, and one of the things we discussed, I'm curious how you feel about this, is something that I've noticed is a lot of what I would think I sort of characterize as particularly rigid, more narrow sort of science of learning advocates tend to, in my experience, come from sort of a math background, sometimes science, but usually math. And then, I was a social studies teacher and psychology and those kinds of things, all these really wonderful open-ended kinds of questions. And then not that there aren't some open-ended questions in math, but obviously it's a much different, much more concrete kind of thing. So I find it it's almost like it's a sort of hidden, elephant in the room. It's like a lot of that rhetoric comes from that math experience background, and that just seems it seems like that should at least be recognized, and that there are some differences in courses and subjects and that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. Oh no, and I think that is being recognised certainly in England. And for the last 5 or 6 years, we've had a real push on kind of generic techniques that are underpinned by the science of learning. But now I think it's moving more towards that subject specific. So actually, you know, what does this look like in this domain? So when I was leading professional development at 11 schools really recently, you know, our PD, we had sort of a generic professional development where we would look at you know, a particular learning problem, put it back to the science of learning, and then look at techniques which might help us with that. And those techniques came from the walkthroughs work, and then they would go into subjects the week after, and they would adapt those techniques but still keeping fidelity to the principles for subject specific. So for example, if you were using mini whiteboards or show me boards and you're in a phys ed lesson, you know, the PE teacher isn't going to have 30 mini whiteboards and markers in his back pocket on the basketball court. So, you know, how are you adapting that? But then there's consistency across that team so that students aren't feeling that extraneous load of having to learn different routines all the time in different lessons. So I think there is a move in England, especially now, to move more towards that subject specific stuff. But that is because they are quite a long way on their science of learning journey when I compare it to some other countries that I've been to.
What is, in your estimation, or when you work with teachers, what's the role of inquiry? How do you describe that? When and where and how? Are there different ways and different courses and different levels of, you know, grade levels and things like that? Like kind of just in general, like how do you describe the role of inquiry in teaching and learning?
Yeah, so I'll speak for English because that's my subject, and a lot of the training that I do on particular pedagogical stances like this is with English teachers. So inquiry is a massive part of English. You know, I want students to be able to see a poem and to be able actually, without much contextual knowledge about the author, etc., to be able to give me an interpretation of that poem, to talk about what it makes you think, feel what you think the authorial purpose is of that poem, what is the message that the writer is trying to teach us. Now that process might then be followed, for example, by some more contextual information about the movement that poet was writing during, say, Romanticism, for example, and that might then illuminate students' understanding. So I'm not a believer that, you know, we have to front load that knowledge when looking at poetry, for example, because actually what students think and feel is valid as well. That may then be proven actually to not be the case, but it's a good learning experience for the pupils to be able to do that. I think the problem is, and I can only speak for England here really, that the syllabus and the curriculum is so packed in our subjects, English especially. You know, they have to read a Victorian novel, a modern novel, 15 poems, unseen poems, a Shakespeare play, a piece of modern theatre, all in 2 years as part of a GCSE subject. So we get to a point with teaching, and I'm guilty of this as well, where we get teachers narrating the right answer because we don't literally have time for that inquiry. And that's not teachers' fault. It's the system, it's the curriculum, and it's the sheer amount of stuff they actually have to get to. So my ideal way of teaching poetry, you know, would be to give students a clean anthology and to say, okay, look at this, let's look at the title together. Then I want you to work in pairs, you know, to look at a stanza each and think about what is the writer trying to tell us, what is their message, how do we know, and why do you think they're trying to tell us this? We just don't have time. So it ends up with a teacher literally just talking at students or using a visualizer to annotate and highlight and then copying.
Yeah. So that brings up the matter of efficiency, right? And that
Yeah.
often comes up in my conversations because I am an advocate, and I think that there's some real power. You've identified, you know, some ways that would resonate with me as well, as like using inquiry first to sort of frame and conceptually, you know, leverage curiosity and all of the kinds of things. But the response I usually get is, you know, that's not efficient, right? That you've got to build this knowledge, and then you can go to Right. And it may be not inefficient, but there's the depth versus breadth kind of, and I taught many things, but one of the two classes that it was always interesting because I taught AP psychology, which that test is coming in May, whether you like it or not. And so we had to stay on schedule with snow days or whatever. And then regular general psychology, where I just sort of joke, I could have taught the same thing every day and nobody would have known. I mean, hopefully the students would have known, but somebody like yourself who was coming in wouldn't know, right? And so I didn't have to be efficient, and I could really play with it. That was probably my favorite class to play with, but that's not the reality of every school. No. So how do we balance that that matter of efficiency, and are there ways to be? I mean, I think there's a colorable argument to say that sometimes inquiry, when used really well, and you have to be careful, and that's a qualifier there, that you can sort of go slow to go fast in some cases. And because you've created this sort of mental model with the inquiry process, that it might slowly come together, then all of a sudden quickly comes together, like, ooh, wow, now I get it, that kind of thing. So I'm curious, so how do you balance that efficiency, or when you're talking with teachers?
Yeah, so I think the key is to something that you just said. It's building that mental model of inquiry with students. So we're not just saying, okay, there's a story or a poem or a novel or whatever, there's a highlighter, off you go.
Right.
What you're actually doing is what you're actually doing is quite science of learning, because you're explicitly teaching students how to inquire effortfully. So that's the difference. So I think there needs to be a definition there of what we mean, because if you say inquiry to most teachers, they'll just think it means choose your own adventure, and that's actually not what you're saying at all. So I think there's the sticking point. So, if there was so what you're talking about essentially is metacognition. With a very, very heavy science of learning evidence base. So, if we kind of explicitly teaching our students to be metacognitive, and Jennifer Webb writes beautifully about this in the Metacognition Handbook, who is incidentally an English teacher, I don't think anybody in English would have a problem with that. I'm not sure about your maths and science, because actually I'm not sure how much of inquiry ever went on in those subjects anyway. I've never been a teacher in those, and I personally hated maths and science when I was at school. Saying that, but I did, because I was just sat in a row being told, what was the right answer, and that's not my bag. So I think that's the key, isn't it? The key there is actually it's that explicit teaching of the skills that are involved in inquiry, and I think even sort of, I don't know, rebadging it a little bit to be more metacognitive, I think might win a few more people over.
Yeah, I think it is funny, I sort of joke that some of the science and learning advocates, activists, whatever, it's almost like saying the word inquiry is like saying, Voldemort or something, they can't really bring themselves to do it. I don't
say his name.
Right. I mean, I'm friendly with Catherine Burblesing, and actually had a chance to meet up with her in New York City years ago, where we were talking about these issues. She's been on the podcast a couple of times, and she is adamantly progressive education is terrible, blah blah blah. And I got her to a point where she almost said, well, if you want to call it inquiry, then fine, but because I'm thinking, okay, what we see is the language and the rhetoric all about building knowledge and direct instruction, of which I think is important, but that's necessary but not sufficient. And at some point, we've got to recognize and talk about that, because it is that synergy. That's where the real deep learning goes. My daughter, who is 19 years old, she is in school to be an elementary teacher, whether I like it or not. And I'm always curious to hear, the lessons and the things that she's doing. Try to peer over her shoulder, incognito, and ask questions. And she's like, Dad. But one of the things that I've wondered on social media, and this is related to her experience, I'm curious how you think about this, is like, so if cognitive science and science of learning advocates had their way, and those things were really embedded in teacher pre-service, like they want them to be, and I'm fine with that. I think that's reasonable. What downstream effects would that have? Are there trade-offs that we should be aware of? Or maybe another way to ask this of you is, what are some of the things that you would design into and perhaps out of teacher pre-service for those incoming teachers?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm a strong advocate in initial teacher education, initial teacher training, whatever you want to call it, as having, you know, a really strong science of learning evidence base. And where I'm an associate professor at La Trobe, that is absolutely the case. And in England, every single ITT by force has to have a science of learning because they're inspected on it by Ofsted. That is part of their core content. It's literally, you won't go into an ITT institution in England and find that they're teaching away from that track. So I know it's different in the US and very different here in Australia, because La Trobe are really swimming against the tide, I would say, by doing that. And I think that, you know, big advocate, I think that's really, really important. But actually what we need to also help trainee teachers understand is that when they go into schools, what they're going to face is lots of competing different bits of research that may contradict some of the things that they've heard during their initial teacher training. It may make them think twice about some of the things that they've heard. And I think that's great. I think it's great to be surrounded by different bits of evidence, but what they've got to find is actually their true north. They've got to see what helps them become better teachers. You know, and I think the science of learning is a really great start for that. But, you know, we've got to tell them not to kind of go forth and be ideologues, essentially, and to, you know, listen, be curious and make their own minds up is what I would say. There's no avoiding, I don't think, you know, and we absolutely should have new teachers learning about how students learn. There's no avoiding that, because it's certainly transformed the way that I teach and the way I think about what I'm doing in the classroom and the micro decisions that I make. But there's also a lot more to teaching as well. There's a big wide world out there that, you know, our trainee teachers are going to be lucky enough to explore in their careers, hopefully. One thing I will say that I think has been a bad thing about the sort of proliferation of cognitive load into everything is the shoehorning of it into teacher development, and it really makes me quite sad. And what I mean by that is in terms of, you know, terming all people who start the profession as a complete novice and then patronising them duly because of it. So what we're doing is taking what we know about how students learn and shoehorning that into teacher expertise development. And there's a huge body of work, Berliner, etc., out there that tells us that teacher expertise development is much more complex than simply novices in an empty bucket to fill by an expert. And I think that kind of obsession with CLT for teacher development has actually driven heaps of professional teachers out of the classroom, because they're patronised and their training is just so repetitive, it's unbelievable. So yeah, that's something that worries me a little bit. I've written about that, I think, on Substack at some stage. But yeah, so I think ultimately, I think science of learning is important for trainee teachers, absolutely. But they are going to go out into the world, into the wilderness, and meet lots of people who have differing beliefs. And it's up to them to find their true north and the research that really helps them do better things in the classroom.
So that brings up something that Mark and I talked about, Mark Inser and I talked about, and you know, he sort of has this triad, right? This sort of dialogue and inquiry and cognitive science.
Yeah.
And he's sort of preaching the importance of doing all of them and how they inform and the synergy, right? I asked him, though, you know, like, one thing that is certainly a reality, we do have novice teachers, we do have more expert teachers. That's not necessarily by age or necessarily by experience, but those things are related, or there's some sort of correlation there. When we think about what we expect of and how we support new teachers, novice teachers, let's say, does it make sense? Because I asked it to him this way. I said, so if you had to choose one of the three, dialogue, inquiry, or cognitive science, which would you choose? Because as much of an inquiry advocate as I am, I would say cognitive science, because at least there's this sort of building of knowledge, and inquiry done really poorly could be disastrous, and dialogue could just be a total waste of time. So, like, is there sort of a stratification that makes sense, or how do we know, or sort of release, and do we release teachers who demonstrate more sort of expertise in being able to do, let's say, all of those three things that Mark has identified at a high level, so that you're sort of giving them a little bit more leash, or maybe a lot more leash, and how do you think about those things?
I don't think we do. That's the thing. And I think that's the big problem. And I think people who are really excellent in the classroom, certainly in England, have no real recognition that they are doing those great things. So in terms of like pay, in terms of anything really. We used to have like a post called, what were they called now? I think it was lead practitioners. We sometimes have a few of them in England, but they've gone more towards like a sort of a middle leader or a leader across a trust of a particular subject. So they've got like, their sort of performance management rests on outcomes and things like that. So their job isn't really about teaching excellence and spreading that and working with colleagues. So I don't think we do that enough. That's the point. And I think we have quite a deficit model of teacher development, I think, all the time, where like, oh, these guys just don't get it. We're going to have to go over this again. And, I was had a leader joining the trust that I used to work at who was saying that the teachers are too thick to deal with complexity, and that actually we just need to back for the lowest common denominator. That made me want to cry, because I just don't believe in that. So for me, those teachers should be the ones that are mentoring and coaching other colleagues. They should be the ones who are working on decision making with other colleagues, and decision making for me is based all around dialogue and talking to teachers, leaders not going into rooms with a clipboard, ticking off things that teachers have done. It's going in curious, seeing every lesson dropping or lesson observation as an inquiry, where you're going to have questions at the end of it that you want to ask that teacher, because actually you might make a judgment when you go in a lesson, because you don't know the subject, you don't know the students, you don't know the context of the lesson. You need to talk to that teacher about the decisions and why they made those decisions. And that's where you can unpick, I think, those things that a teacher did really, really well and can do better. And often a teacher, through that unpicking process, realizes those things themselves without some so-called expert who usually hasn't taught for at least 5 years going in and telling them what they should be doing and shouldn't.
Yeah, well, that therein lies, at least the problem that I've experienced is the lack of time and structures and systems to be able to do that, right? And as a teacher, I taught for 15 years and had, assistant principal. I had an assistant principal one time give me the evaluation sheet, that he was meant to fill out as he was doing the evaluation and observation of me. He gave it to me and said, I want you to fill this out. It's absolutely not. I mean, come on, what are we doing here? And one of the things that I know you've written about this is a sort of professionalism. I felt at the end of my career, I was pretty burned out because there was just not the intellectual nourishment that I was looking for. No. I actually had found, he's a good friend of mine now. He works for the Department of Education, and he was an English teacher who I'd not really known. Then he moved into an academic coach, and I heard him speak before the staff at the beginning of the year. I thought, oh my gosh, I mean, it was like oxygen, right? And I asked him, like, can I be one of your teachers in your sort of stable of coaches? And those conversations are really rich, right? With somebody who knows they don't have to be perfect. They have to ask questions and think, okay, so here's what you were trying to get to. Did it work, and why didn't it work? And those reflective conversations. But as a professional development provider, I rarely get an opportunity to do that. And even in schools, and I don't know what your experience has been, but are we getting the time to do that? And how do we get the time to do that? And what are the things we can do to get that time? And It's tough.
Well, it needs to be timetabled in, because if it isn't, it won't happen. So I know that there are schools, like there's a big multi-academy trust in England called Chiltern, and they're lucky enough to have Adam Colbeck, who's written a book about coaching with myself and Sarah Cottingham, which is all around dialogue and decision making, called Coaching for Adaptive Expertise. And Adam is head of teacher development there, director of teacher development. I'm not sure what his title is, but they're lucky enough to have Adam there, who has worked with all of the school leaders to make sure that this time is actually timetabled in. And what that means is cutting out some of the things that we're doing for the sake of it, because we've always done them and then they're not working. So things even like, changing sort of department meetings, if you like, from like admin gathering, and having a moan about the senior leaders, or all of those things that you do in department meetings. Who needs glue sticks? Those questions. Changing those into like a real to do the deep work of the curriculum, that intellectual preparation. And that's the point there where professionals get to talk together about decisions and choices. So schools choose to use their CPD for certain things because that's the way they've always done it. And I think it needs a massive rebranding and a rethinking. And there are some really great leaders doing this stuff, but it's just finding them and using them as best practice, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's a two sides of the coin, right? I worked with a school last year, and one of the first things I did was talking with the whole staff, and I said, what's important? What do you like about this school? What helps you do your work well, and things like that? Just, some of those get to know you kinds of questions. And one of those questions, the answer was resoundingly, "Oh, we love the autonomy we have here." Yeah. And I said, "Okay, great. What does that require of you?"
Yeah.
Right. That requires of you to not abuse that, because, teachers say we never have enough time to plan. You give them a lot of time. And quite honestly, and I've been there, I did this, right? Like you moaning about the leaders or this kid or that kind of, or you're running copies or whatever. And some of that is healthy, and you need some of that, right? You need some of that sort of just downtime. Yeah. Because too much, PLCs, like all of a sudden you're all of the time doing protocols and all these kinds of things. Yeah. But, like I use the term intellectually rigorous educators, right? So we want educators to be intellectually rigorous. We want them to be professional. We want them to be thinking about constantly, how am I improving my craft, and having those conversations collegially. And that's honestly, I think those sort of collegial peer conversations, if we can structure those in, and you have to build a culture there, right? Yes, you have to, yeah. Those will happen organically, and it's so challenging.
It is challenging, and I also think our middle leaders who are leading those conversations also need explicit training on how to do it, because I think what happens is in schools we are good at our job and we're suddenly catapulted into being a leader, or this was certainly true of me, and I had no training, no kind of mental model, no role models, no blueprint at all as to how to do this stuff. I've just learned it by accident going through my career. And a lot of the sort of training that is out there accredited for middle leaders is, I think, more of that just implementation science of learning, but this other stuff matters too. And most leaders I speak to will tell me that some of the biggest problems that they have to solve are the relational problems with colleagues and parents. Mm-hmm. We get no training on it.
Right. Well, one last question, I think. No promises, but I think this will be the last question. When you think about my daughter being a 19-year-old and in teacher prep, any advice that you think? Obviously, you don't know what her background and what she's studying, so it's a bit of an unfair question. But what advice, if you had her ear, or obviously I will have her ear, should I pass on to her? And she wants to be early elementary educator, so I don't know if that informs it.
Opposite of what I did, which was secondary English. The small ones freak me out. I can't cope. But yeah, what I would say is, to quote Margaret Atwood, and I think somebody else before her, is "Don't let the bastards grind you down." And sorry for swearing. But I honestly, genuinely think that it's really noisy to be a teacher in today's climate. And that noise comes from people like me or us working in CPD spaces saying, you're doing this wrong, you should be doing this. It comes from government, and Lord knows things are going on in the US at the moment that I think it would need another 10 podcasts to talk about. It comes from parents who are suddenly equipped with ChatGTP to write the most awesome complaint letters you've ever seen in your life, and know every piece of legislation you've ever seen. There's noise from every part of the world when you're a teacher in the classroom, and of course from the public, who think that because they went to school they get what happens in classrooms and what teachers do. So I would say to her, don't let them grind you down. Keep the focus on the children in front of you, which is surely why you came into this profession. And just that, being a teacher has been the greatest privilege of my life, and I've loved it. And, there's students who I taught now who are married, who met in the seating plan that I put them together in, and teachers who are heads of department and assistant principals in school who I taught. And it's just the greatest joy of my life to have known that I had just that tiny little bit of influence on that young person that made them into the people that they've become today. And she's got the best influence because she's got them right at the start of their influence as well. So forget the noise. Don't take things personally, and keep focused on those kids, because it is the best job in the world.
Well, it's a great place to end. And the unfortunate thing I think about early elementary teachers is, you're right, they are in the formative stages, but the gap between when the teachers have them and then they become adults and
Yes.
might have conversations with them as an adult is so big.
Oh,
As a high school teacher, and my guess is you've experienced this as well, especially if you've been in any place for a long time. I have been where I live now since 2001, and now I'm playing golf with some of my former students, and they invited me on a golf trip, and to see them grow into now some of them school leaders and community leaders. And it is really rewarding, and
it's amazing.
In a way that's hard to explain to people that don't get it. But
I agree. I actually so I only worked in 2 schools and then a multi-academy trust for the last year of my career. But I only worked in 2 schools over a really long amount of time, and they were both in villages. And I used to bump into the students and their parents all the time, and it was a bit like being a celebrity. And I kind of miss it, to be honest. So it's amazing.
Yeah. Well, I know you have your Substack. I want to make sure, give you an opportunity if there's anything that you haven't had a chance to say. Now's the time to do that. But links and places that they should find you. Your Substack is
I think it's
Haili
Hughes.
Hughes at .substack.com, and we'll put that in the. You can just search Dr. Haili Hughes, and we'll put the link to that. Where else should they find you? You said some social media, like that?
LinkedIn probably. I don't post on X really anymore. I've got a lot of followers on there amassed over many years, so I keep it open just for, I don't know, nostalgic things. But I don't tend to post on there anymore because it's the very definition of bad faith actors, I think, over on there. LinkedIn and Substack as well. But always happy to chat to people, and for people to tell me I'm wrong, that's fine.
Matter of fact, I appreciate it. I mean, when I talked with Mark, I said I was hoping we would disagree on some more things than we did, and we didn't really disagree, because that to me is where the learning is, right? These podcasts and people who are talking to the choir, preaching to the choir, it's like, that just seems like a very boring conversation. I want to have somebody push back against me, that kind of thing. So anyways, well, thank you. I'm glad we finally got on. People don't know, but you were supposed to be on a panel salon conversation of sort some time ago. Maybe we'll try to get one of those. If not, have you back solo again sometime. So appreciate the conversation.
No problem. Great to be here. Thanks, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.